Hello, my name is Edward Ferguson, and this is assignment 2-1 for studies in the Old Testament historical books. In this short video, we will be looking at how historical books are different from other books in the Old Testament and New Testament. In order to do that, we'll be looking at how their subject matter is different, the process of interpreting might be different, their theological themes, and then lastly, how they apply to Christian life. Let's begin with their subject matter. In the book, The Art of Biblical History, Phillips Longs gives us this explanation of history. He says the term history is used in at least two different senses, history as event and history as account. While never losing sight of the former, we focus primarily on the latter, which might be better termed historiography. Understanding history as account is important for us to understand the subject matter of the historical books. While other books in the Old Testament might be describing the law, like in the Pentateuch, or helping us feel the emotions of life, which is what we experience in the books of poetry, or even in the New Testament where the personhood of Jesus is revealed to us in the Gospels, or theology is explained throughout the epistles. Here, in the historical books, we are looking at something very specific. In the book Cracking the Old Testament Code, in his chapter entitled History, Eugene Merrill gives us this twofold understanding of this subject matter in the historical books. He says they are first, national, and second, a series. First of all, national. The subject of the historical books are the people of Israel. This is who they are speaking of. This is not biographical. This is not some exposition, but it truly is an account of these people. The second aspect there is that it is a series, or what he refers to as a cause-effect sequence. These separate accounts of history are all connected to each other. They are a sequence because they are speaking of the larger subject matter of the people of Israel. While we might be looking at the life of Joshua or the life of King David, they are specifically in reference to the larger subject of the people of Israel. He does add that the kind of other element inside the subject matter is the commentary from the author, that the author does interject to help us understand how this cause and effect sequence does work together with one another. And so it's important to help us understand that one of the things that's very different in the historical books is they have a very specific subject matter. They are about the cause and effect sequence of the people of Israel. And this impacts our process of interpreting these books, which is different than others, where we might be able to dive into an epistle, observe, answer, and apply. Here, we need to dive in and take a little bit more time and understand that this is not speaking directly into our life, but is speaking of the people of Israel. Philip Long also says that responsible biblical interpretation requires the adoption of self-conscious sense of a historical perspective that is alert to the stubborn and interesting differences between the world of the Bible and the modern world, but at the same time recognize that there are also elements of continuity. And that difference is really understanding that we need to take time and understand that this is about the people of Israel, not us. And that is where Eugene Merrill, in his chapter History, gives a 7-step process for interpretation. And I summarize it this way. First, we need to determine the scope that we're looking at. What is that specific cause and effect sequence that we're looking at? Maybe it is a specific vignette in the life of David. What is that cause and effect sequence that we're looking at? Second of all, we need to recognize that this is a record, that some detail may be lacking. 3, what is the author's purpose? Maybe seek to look for some of that commentary that is interjected there. Number 4, we need to examine its features. What is the biblical context inside of this specific scope? Maybe it's social, religious, political, or even geographical context that help us see the features of this particular passage. Number 5, don't suppose it is prescriptive. And this is probably the area that we are or trap that we most easily fall into in our process of interpreting historical books in comparison to others. Just because Gideon drank his water one particular way doesn't mean that every time we drink water we need to follow his way, that's somehow prescribing God's way of drinking water. That we get creative in our ways of taking what a character does in historical books and over prescribing it into our lives. And that's really where we look at number 6. Let detail support. It's there to support, and we don't need to drag it out to be something bigger than it actually is. And ultimately, we arrive at number 7 in this process. Don't look for devotional or doctrinal content everywhere. Where we dive into some of our New Testament books and understand what doctrinal content does this explain about the personhood of Jesus Christ? What does the Mount of Transfiguration describe about who Jesus is? Or we get into the Psalms and see how we are to feel the fear of God in that devotional content. In the historical books, we're looking again at the subject matter, the people of Israel, and what are those cause and effect sequences of their actions, their sinful actions, and God's response to that. That is what we're looking for in understanding. And really that arrives at the last 2 elements of understanding the historical books, the theological themes and their application to Christian life. In the theological themes, in his book Interpreting the Historical Books, Robert Chisholm gives us this helpful explanation. He says, though the historical books do not resolve the tension in the Old Testament's macro plot, they do hint at the future is bright because Israel's God is committed to overcoming all obstacles. And that's really where Chisholm arrives at his explanation of 2 major theological themes found in the historical books. The first that he outlines is that God's covenantal relationship with his people. And the second of all is the establishment of kingship. There might be in other books like Philippians a very prescriptive theology, or in Romans where we get a very didactic theology. In the historical books, he's setting a bigger picture. God cares about his covenant people, and we want to see this kingship, which ultimately arrives at Jesus. How does this apply to our Christian life? Well, many times we look at the historical books and want to ask the question, how does this apply to me? That is the wrong question to ask. The better question to ask in the Old Testament historical books is, what do I learn about who God is? And a great follow-up question to that is, how does who he is impact my life? Instead of reading Scripture through the lens of everything being about us, we need to understand that Scripture is about who God is. And specifically in the historical books, who God is and how has he interacted with his people. When they sin, what is the cause of their sin? What is the effect on their life? And how does God redeem that? And when we look to apply that into our own lives, we begin to see how we begin to have those cause and effect relationships in our life. And who is God, and how does he help us through those things? And these are just a few of the reasons why the historical books are different than some of the other books in the Old and New Testament.